Our next speaker, Monsignor Andrew Wadsworth, is a great joy and a delight for us to be able to have at our Sacred Liturgy Conference. One of the great world's experts of liturgical texts, especially sacred music texts. Monsignor Wadsworth has been the executive director of ISIL since the fall of 2009, and he's the co-founder of the community of St. Philip Neri in Washington, D.C., where he's currently the moderator, and he holds master's degrees in Italian, theology, and music. Monsignor Wadsworth has a great love for sacred music and has had a considerable experience in the training in this area. In fact, he has published research in various areas, including Marian studies, Dante, the history of liturgical translation in English. He is a recorded vocalist and has received awards such as the Ricordi Prize for choral conducting. As of late, he's been traveling around the world and continues to do that by coming to Oregon, of course, to speak on sacred music and liturgical text. He has spoken in New Zealand, England, the United States, Hong Kong, Canada, France, Italy, and I'm sure many other places. It is a great joy and a great privilege for us to be gathered here together to reflect together with the words of Monsignor Wadsworth.
I'd just like to begin by thanking Monsignor Hoeniger for the most magisterial presentation we could possibly have had of the scriptural texts that treat of the Transfiguration. And that's certainly a talk that I shall want to listen to again with my notebook and pen in hand, I think. I'm just relieved he didn't have any musical examples because I wouldn't have anything to speak to you about now. As I'm speaking, I'm hoping that winging its way to you is a handout which will accompany my remarks this morning. I have to say that in distinction to our former speakers, I am notoriously low-tech. So I am my own visual aid, and you have the texts of the hymns that I'm going to comment upon, but we shall listen to them. And without subjecting you to my own singing, or making you sing, indeed, at this early hour, we're going to listen to recordings of those hymns. In his landmark study, Light on the Mountain, Greek patristic and Byzantine homilies on the Transfiguration of the Lord, the Jesuit patristic scholar Father Brian Daly reveals how the Transfiguration of our Lord plays a key role in the narrative and structure of the Synoptic Gospels. The Feast of the Transfiguration, as we've heard, is narrated in three pericopes: Matthew 17, verses 1 to 8, Mark 9, verses 2 to 8, and Luke 9, verses 28 to 36. St. Matthew sets the context as follows. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, approached, rolled back the stone, and sat upon it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. The guards were shaken with fear of him and became like dead men. Then the angel said to the women in reply, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are seeking Jesus, the crucified." This mountaintop theophany is one of the miracles of Jesus that identify him as the Christ, the Son of God. St. Thomas Aquinas considered this to be the greatest of the miracles, complementing the revelation of Christ's divine nature as evidenced in the gospel accounts of his baptism. 5th century custom identifies the mountain as Mount Tabor in Lower Galilee, upon which now rests the Church of the Transfiguration. But as we've just heard, more recent scholarship, however, suggests that Mount Hermon, which spreads itself over current Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, is a somewhat more likely location because of its closeness to Caesarea Philippi, mentioned in the previous chapter of Matthew's Gospel. St. Mark tells us that the revelation that Christ is the Messiah was to be kept a secret by the disciples until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The book of Malachi had predicted that Elijah would return before the coming of the Messiah. Father Brian Daly's translation of a comprehensive collection of homilies on the Transfiguration, drawn from both Greek authors and the medieval church, dating from Origen in the 3rd century to St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, gives substance to the Pauline notion that the light of the recognition of the glory of God is in the face of Christ. These patristic commentaries reach back even further to a theme of enchantment with the holy place that is so present in many Old Testament texts, and principally in the Psalms. An interesting example of this is the prayer of Balaam, found in Numbers chapter 24. Balaam, a pagan, is sent to curse the Israelites, but instead, when he arrives, he is completely overcome with awe at the presence of God in the Israelites' houses of worship. And he blesses God in the only prayer commonly used in Jewish services to this day that was written by a non-Jew. Ma tovo oaleka Yaakov, mishkanatecha Israel. How great are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. The remainder of the prayer, which is still recited upon entering a synagogue, is derived from passages in the Psalms relating to entering the house of worship and preparation for prayer. As for me, through your abundant grace, I enter your house to worship with awe in your sacred place. O Lord, I love the house where you dwell and the place where your glory tabernacles. By way of comparison, one might be tempted to consider the reflection on the significance of the Transfiguration to be somewhat less substantial in the writings of the Church in the West. That view would certainly be challenged if one considers the riches of the hymnody for the Feast of the Transfiguration, which is found both in the older forms of the Liturgy of the Hours and in the more recent liturgical books that have been produced since the Second Vatican Council. The Roman Breviary offers the hymn Quicumque Christum Queritis at both Vespers and Matins. A hymn in iambic dimeter, the most common of the hymnic meters, it is an extract from the 12th and last poem of the Catameronon of Prudentius. The complete poem consists of 208 lines and is the source of a further 3 separate hymns to be found in the Roman Breviary. O Solo Magnarum Urbium, hymn for the Feast of the Epiphany. Audit Tyrannus Anxius, hymn for Matins of the Feast of the Holy Innocents. And Salvete Flores Martyrum, hymn for Lords of the Feast of the Holy Innocents. On a completely separate note, and by way of an aside, Salvete Flores Martyrum was often quoted by St. Philip Neri, the founder of the oratory. He used it to greet the seminarians of the Venerable English College in Rome, in the knowledge that these young men as priests would soon be returning to England and almost certain martyrdom for their Catholic faith. The hymn Quicumque Christum Queritis offers a magnificent account of the gospel narratives of the Transfiguration in terms of the impact of this experience on the 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, who in this moment perceive that they are in the presence of the promised King, the Messiah who fulfills the hope of Israel, and is before them accompanied by the witnesses to the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah, and appears in the unmitigated splendor of his divinity as a pledge of future glory. You have the Latin text, before you alongside the translation of Alan G. Dougal. Let us hear it now as sung by the appropriately named Gloria Dei Cantores, directed by my own teacher, the late Dr. Mary Berry. Musical example 1, please. In that performance, the hymn has a somewhat altered doxology. In fact, more recently, the doxologies were all rewritten so that they reflect, each of them, the mystery that is named and celebrated in the hymn. I draw your attention to the second strophe of this hymn, wonderfully ethereal, sung as it was here by the women's voices. A wondrous sign we there behold, that knows not death nor groweth old, sublime most high, that cannot fade, that was ere earth and heaven were made. This relationship between heaven and earth, which of course is continually present to us in the liturgy, is an aspect of the enchantment that I think comes to us in a major way from the mystery of the Transfiguration. And of course, it's the music in the liturgy which substantially contributes towards our experience of that enchantment. Perhaps that's something we don't adequately consider. Every time that the Mass begins, the singing of the introit, as the priest and ministers enter for the celebration of the Mass, is intended to cause us to wonder, to be in awe at the sacred liturgy now beginning, to be caught up into this mystery which makes the life of heaven come to us here and now. I can't help thinking that too often our experiences of the liturgy are earthbound, not pointing us to heaven in the way that the Church intends and the riches of the Church's tradition imply. The second hymn found in the Breviarium Romanum is much later and is traditionally attributed to St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Lux alma Jesu mentium is given for lauds. The Analecta Hymnica Medievi reveals that the hymn is an abstract from the familiar hymn in iambic dimeter, Jesu dulcis memoria, which in its original form began Amor Jesu dulcissime. I should explain to you that the Analecta Hymnica is an invaluable 55-volume resource for the Latin poetry of the medieval church from around the year 500 to the year 1400. It was published progressively from 1886 to 1922 under the direction of Guido Maria Dreves, and it's the most authoritative and most extensive collection of the church's hymnody. Amazingly, this is one of the resources that is now available digitally and can be searched very, very easily, something that's very important for scholars, not least of those who are concerned with the hymnody of the church. Blessed John Henry Newman of the Oratory provides a translation of this hymn in the form in which it appears in the Roman Breviary. I haven't given you that text, but I'd like you to listen to it now as I read it. Light of the anxious heart, Jesus, thou dost appear to bid the gloom of guilt depart and shed thy sweetness here. Joyous is he with whom God's word thou dost abide, sweet light of our eternal home to fleshly sense denied. Brightness of God above, unfathomable grace, thy presence be a fount of love within thy chosen place. To thee whom children see, the Father ever blessed, the Holy Spirit, one and three, be endless praise addressed. Once again, in that third strophe, we've got this enchantment with the place. Thy presence be a fount of love within thy chosen place. The hymn is full of the radiance of the event it describes. And even if this is not Newman at his sparkling best, it shows that Victorian hymnody need not always be as stylistically heavy as is so often the case in Victorian purpled prose. It is Newman's contemporary and confrere, Father Edward Caswell of the Oratory, who gives us a full translation of the entire text. And by that I'm referring to what scholars call the Jubilus, which is ascribed to St. Bernard of Clairvaux, from which the hymn is excerpted, and which also gives us the source of a rather well-known hymn, Jesu dulcis memoria, which is best known in the English translation by Caswell, Jesu, or Jesu, the very thought of thee. Neither quicunque Christum queritis, nor lux alma Jesu mensium appear in the office of the Solemnity of the Transfiguration as given in the modern Liturgy of the Hours. Quicunque Christum queritis does, however, appear in an adapted form in the hymn Dulcis Jesu Memoria. It appears, as the office hymn for the Christmas season after the Feast of the Epiphany. Certain of the strophes are rework, others are selected from the Jubilus, and it appears in that context in the Christmas season. The hymn Dulcis Jesu Memoria at Lourdes offers a text which might be considered to be a derivative of Lux Alma Jesu Mensium, as it is also based on a selection of strophes taken from the Jubilus. The Benedictine Don Anselmo Lentini, 1902 to 1989, who was responsible for the redaction of the hymnody in the Liturgy of the Hours, tells us in his publication Te Decet Laus that strophes 1, 2, and 3 of the hymn, in its modern form, correspond to strophes 1, 2, and 4 of the Jubilus, and represent elements of that text which André Wilmart describes as pure, whereas strophe 5 is adapted and the doxology is newly composed. You have the Latin text of the new hymn, Dulcis Jesu Memoria, together with the English translation, which we hope will be in the revised Liturgy of the Hours when it appears. Let's look at that hymn together in the proposed ISIL translation, for the forthcoming revised edition of the Liturgy of the Hours, and listen once more to the Gloria Dei Cantores. Musical example 2, please.
Dulcis Iesu memoria, transfera qualicaria, sed super me omnia, eius dulcis presentia.
Nil caritus suavius, auditur nihil cultus, nil cogitator dulcius, quam Jesus Dei filius.
Iesu dulce memorium, fons verum lumen mensium, excelis omne gaudium, et omne desiderium.
Quando cor nostrum visitas, tu luce Dei veritas, mundi vincit vanitas, et ictus feret caritas.
Da nobis largus veniam, amoris pluricordiam, da nobis per presentiam tuam videre gloriam. Laudes tibi nos angimus, dilectus est qui filius, quem Patris atque Spiritus, splendor revelat implitus.
Once again, the theme of enchantment is present if we look at strophes 3 and 4. Strophes 2 and 3. No voice can sing a gentler song, no ear can hear a gladder note, no mind can think a sweeter thought than Jesus, Son of God Most High. O Jesus, sweetness for the heart, light for the mind and font of truth, surpassing every earthly joy and far exceeding all desire. The hymn goes on to touch the characteristic theme of light so central to the mystery of the Transfiguration. When you draw near to cheer our hearts, truth gleams and gives them holy light. All earthly pride grows old and vain, and charity burns bright within. And then progressing to the effect of this revelation upon us. Good Jesus, pardon us our sin, show us the treasures of your love, and grant us through your presence, Lord, to gaze upon your majesty. The hymn at the office of readings, the hour of the Liturgy of the Hours, which is equivalent to the traditional hour of matins in the Roman breviary or the monastic office of vigils, is Celestis Formam Gloriae. This is an anonymous text, probably dating from the 13th century, which is found in the Sarum breviary in the 15th century. Let us hear the hymn in its chant setting, sung once again by the Gloria Dei Cantores. The translation you have before you is once again the ISL proposal for the revised Liturgy of the Hours.
Celestis formam gloriae, quam spes verbit ecclesiae, in morte Christus implicat, qui supra solem venitat.
Res memoranda seculis, tribus coram discipuli,
This beautiful hymn describes the light, wonder, and majesty of the Transfiguration, as well as teasing out some of its implications for us in detail. In stanza 2, the Lord converses with the prophets Moses and Elijah. These prophets are described in the hymn as witnesses to grace and to the Father's voice from a cloud. Stanza 4 states that the glory of Christ manifested in this miraculous happening will someday be for all faithful souls. The 5th stanza joins the mystery of the Transfiguration to us. The mystery of this wondrous sight lifts up the hearts that live by faith. And so with great and solemn joy, we sing devoted praise and cry, therefore leading beautifully into the doxology, O Father, with the only Son, and with the Spirit Paraclete, now through your presence, three in one, bestow on us this glorious light. Amen. The Vesper hymn for the Liturgy of the Hours is given as O Nata Lux de Lumine, an anonymous text of the 9th century, which, apart from the omission of a single strophe for the sake of brevity, is largely adopted in the Liturgy of the Hours in its unrevised form. Once again, the translation before you is the ISL proposal for the revised Liturgy of the Hours. But I'd like us to listen to some of the strophes of this hymn as they are set by the 16th century English composer Thomas Tallis. So you hear it now not as a chant hymn, but as a polyphonic motet. This is to give you an idea of how hymn texts have a life sometimes outside of the Liturgy of the Hours. This setting by Tallis is sung here by the Chapelle du Roi. At this point, we are quite reasonably tempted to wonder why such a departure from the hymnody of the Roman Breviary was deemed to be necessary after the Council in the preparation of the more recent liturgical books. To understand that question better, we need to consider the broader history of the development of Latin hymnody in our liturgical books. And for what I'm going to give you in brief form this morning, I am indebted to the research of Gregory de Pippo, who narrates this history in a series of posts that he published on the blog New Liturgical Movement. One of the things that we seem to be lacking in scholarship at the present time is a narrative that gets us from Sacrosanctum Concilium to the production of the new liturgical books. So if there are any budding scholars out there, the archive for the Concilium is in my office in Washington in one of its forms. It's all in digital files and can easily be accessed. There are plenty of doctoral theses waiting to be written. The Roman liturgical books were somewhat modest in adopting hymns in comparison to regional texts of local rites or the texts which were adopted by monastic communities. The medieval hymns survived basically untouched until the time of Pope Urban VIII, who was himself a skilled classicist. Beware of Latinists. He personally composed the hymns of Saints Hermegild, St. Martina, and St. Elizabeth of Portugal, all in various classical meters rather than the more usual iambic dimeters characteristic of medieval hymns and represented by the hymns that we've looked at this morning. To him, as to many Latinists of the Renaissance before him, the hymns of the liturgy needed to be revised to bring them into greater conformity with the vocabulary and metric forms of classical Latin poetry. You may feel that you've heard something of this narrative before. Pope Urban established a commission to undertake the revision, but having established the commission, seems to have done much of the work himself. In the course of the revision, hardly a single hymn was left untouched, notwithstanding their antiquity or the fact that their authors were saints. The hymns of St. Ambrose, to whom far more were attributed at the time than modern scholars would now grant, had been in more or less continuous use in the Church for over 12 centuries. Even the magnificent Passiontide hymns of St. Venantius were substantially reworked. All told, several hundred metrical corrections were made in the hymnal, and some hymns, such as the 2 for the dedication of a church and the 3 of Eastertide, were so drastically rewritten as to constitute entirely different work. The hymn of St. Michael's Day, Tibi Christe Splendor Patris, was completely altered in both its text and meter. Although the new hymns became the standard text of the Roman breviary and remain so to this day in the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, they were not received everywhere with enthusiasm. The chapters of many major churches retained use of the older hymns, not least among them the chapter of St. Peter's Basilica itself. None of the religious orders which retained the use of their proper breviaries after the Council of Trent, such as the Premonstratensians, ever adopted the new text, nor did any of the monastic breviaries. That accounts for the differences that you find in the text if you go to a Benedictine monastery and they're using the traditional Benedictine office, the difference between those Latin texts and the texts which are found in the Roman breviary. Liturgical scholarship has been as unsparing in its criticism of Urban VIII's revision as the religious orders were unwelcoming of it. A general attitude to Urban's revision is found in the witticism of his contemporaries. Accessit Latinitas, recessit pietas. Latinity came in, piety went out. There is a popular misconception that the Liturgy of the Hours promulgated by Pope Paul VI in 1970 completely restored the hymns to their pre-Urban VIII text. I would have to say that this is only partially true. It is true that the older text was the basis of the reform, and that most of what was done under Pope Urban did not find its way into the post-conciliar version of the hymnal. However, a very large number of changes were made to the older texts by the committee or cetus responsible for a new selection and revision of the hymns. In the year 1984, Don Anselmo Lentini, the head of the committee, published a very informative dossier of its work called Te Decit Hymnus, noting in the introduction that of the numerous committees that produced the new liturgy, his was almost the only cetus of the concilium responsible for the formation of the new liturgical books, to publish a complete record of its activities. And I have to say that Dom Lentini was very, very meticulous in telling us what he's done. It's all there for those who want to see. The hymns are arranged in an order similar to the order in the breviary itself. The hymns of the Psalter, of the liturgical seasons, the proper of the saints, and the common offices. Each hymn is accompanied by a critical apparatus indicating its author and age, if known, and its meter, the critical editions of the hymn where available, and the breviaries in which it was used after the Tridentine Reform where applicable. There then follows notes on the changes to the original text made by the Cetus. I want to conclude this reflection on hymns with you this morning by saying a little about the hymnody which has been proposed for the forthcoming revised edition of the Liturgy of the Hours. You will know that the USCCB, the Bishops of the United States, made the decision at the beginning of the work on this text that they would provide English translations for the 293 hymns found in the Liturgy of the Hours. I can't tell you what a momentous decision that was. This is the first time that the whole corpus of hymnody has appeared in English in an official liturgical book. 60 years following the publication of the Liturgy of the Hours in Latin. Consequently, the International Commission on English in the Liturgy has undertaken the translation of these texts, and each hymn is presented with the Gregorian chant melody, which is ascribed to its Latin text in the Liber Hymnarius produced by the monks of Salem. In addition to the Gregorian chant melodies, there will also be suggestions for metrical hymn tunes for each hymn, which offer an alternative to the chant melody. Once again, the significance of this development is not to be underestimated, as it represents the restoration of a massive quantity of the liturgical text, which thus far has not been available in the English liturgical book. In this way, these hymns, many of them written in the first millennium, will be seen as integral to the Liturgy of the Hours. And their special function in the task of the Liturgy of the Hours, which is of course the sanctification of time, will be more clearly perceived and hopefully more effectively experienced by all who engage in the daily prayer of the Church. Thank you very much.
Well, that was very splendid, Monsignor Wadsworth. Thank you very much. We were able to experience the reality that chant can be enchanting and that Jesus himself is enchanting. And so we are therefore able to be enchanted by Jesus himself through the text of the liturgy, especially the hymnody. And thank you, Monsignor, for your work in the translation of these hymns and organizing an authentic liturgical reform that incorporates the gift of the tradition of the Church, available in English, faithful, of course, to the original text. A very time-consuming, arduous work full of political maneuvering. And so we thank you and ask the Holy Spirit to continue to guide you in this work.